Thank you so much, Simon, for your fabulous keynote presentation. I wanted to begin with some questions that came to my mind, and then hopefully we can take our discussion from there. As a historian, fellow historian, I wanted to first ask why you think memory became such a preoccupation in the late 19th and earlier 20th century. These early figures that you talk about, Bergson, Proust, Freud, we could add Nabokov in there as well. What is it about this period that leads to this new wave of memory thinking?
Oh, thanks, Tamsin. Well, I think there's multiple explanatory factors in play here. So perhaps I could just outline a few of those now. We could think about demographic changes, for example. Increasing life expectancy allowed for more time to reflect, and authors kind of increasingly came to want to look back over their own lives and the events that they'd witnessed. I suppose perhaps also armed with that Wordsworthian idea that the child is the father of the man, there was also a desire among all the writers you mentioned to understand the sequences of life that had led them to the present. Now, linked to that, we could also look to the rise of the psychological and education sciences, and to heightened awareness of subjectivities, or what would later be called technologies of the self. So the sort of desire to seek to comprehend the motor mechanisms of the mind, as perhaps Bergson would have put it, of memory and the causality of dispositions. A few other factors as well, perhaps in play too, a kind of fear of anonymity amidst increased urbanization. We could think here of the writings of Georg Simmel in the early 1900s, a sociologist. Shifting and accelerating senses of temporality, a sense that time might be slipping through one's fingers and a need to kind of grasp hold of it. And finally, perhaps, events which had a more global impact, like the Great War, there was an awareness that they might be experienced differentially and remembered very differently as well. And scholars, I think, wanted to unpick that too. So I guess a whole bunch of things probably interacting here to make this a fertile period for the kind of birth of memory studies.
I mean, that's really interesting. And you mentioned the sort of shifting temporalities, which I'm assuming you're kind of referring to the acceleration of life that come with industrialization, standardization, steam, the telegraph.
And all of that, yeah.
Yeah. Do you think, I mean, I think you just did at it in a few of those aspects, but maybe you can linger on it a bit more, that the industrialization of life. I mean, we here are living through a period of technological explosion in which the ways we subjectively experience the world around us are now mediated in a new way by digital technology. And, you know, in a way, all those actors also experience something similar in the ways that their lives were mediated. And you know, someone like Nabokov cites the before and the after really explicitly, you know, in his work. Is there something at play there about a lost world? Again, that is a lost, that is a Proustian phrase.
Yeah, I think so. A lost world, and also a lost sense of self-assertion within that world, due to those kind of anonymous time-related factors. I suppose a good place to kind of capture a sense of this is the 1920s film Modern Times, with Charlie Chaplin starring, where he actually goes into the machine at one point and becomes a kind of nervous, fidgety individual as a result, and then gets swept up in political revolution, and gender politics is through the film as well. So I think yes, you're right, and I think we are also witnessing something similar now.
Yeah, and it's kind of that I wanted to sort of talk about next, because if industrialization was an acceleration was the context of the emergence of memory studies and collective memory, what does the emergence of the digital mean for us now in our social and material contexts and the resources that we use to recruit, you know, in a way, to use a science studies term, and what effect does that have? So in particular, I wanted to ask about the textual social construction of memory, which is key to the kind of concept of collective memory. And in a way, you know, thinking about inherited memory and trauma might be thought of as a way of thinking about the longitudinal or the temporalities, so the social temporal constructions of collective memory. So what are the kind of long vectors of memory that we should keep in view when we seek to analyze domains of public engagement, such as Wikipedia? I guess here I'm thinking about how do older analog structures from a pre-digital age continue to shape the digital realm and the ways we, you know, act in it and with it.
Yes, okay. So I guess we might think about the applicability of the term digital affordances here. I think this is a really interesting one to think with. It's a shaping factor. So namely, these are the social and economic capabilities and indeed insults that lead people to engage with digital domains or not. So for example, we've all encountered kind of digital firewalls, the inability to access certain forms of content, and probably been asked to send articles and so on to our friends and colleagues elsewhere who can't, for whatever reason, access them. I think also in regard to these vectors, we probably ought to think about the difference between the groups that have been labelled digital immigrants and digital natives. These are imperfect terms for those who kind of came to the digital revolution as they aged, and those for whom it was there from birth. And the former kind of remember and retain technologies that harbour inherited memories and traumas. So I guess we could think about photograph albums here, which in times gone by, one would paste and print photographs into an album, but one also might add kind of analog or handwritten letters and diaries and so on, other forms of inherited material culture. And those of us that are digital immigrants probably also remember things that were inaccessible for various reasons, floppy disks that no longer worked, or USB sticks that kind of went wrong at various times. And ensuring kind of those digital legacies is now a major concern of funding providers, and poses challenges for historians, because, you know, in the 19th century, if one was, say, researching high politics, one might look at parliamentary circulars or private letters that came into archives, but now, unless they're leaked, lots of the information is in chains of WhatsApp kind of messages back and forth. So it's kind of harder to access that.
Are you thinking of your Prime Minister?
Well, yes, indeed. Former, yes, we had
former Prime Minister.
Yes, in the news again today, with more possible lockdown parties that came about, revealed also through such electronic discussions. For the digital realm, though, as well, I think what's really useful is that we can look back at earlier iterations of the web through such portals as Wayback Machine and have a sense of what was there before. But we have to be aware there's vulnerability here too. So things like, you know, MySpace obliterated millions of photographs and blog posts some years ago. So I guess that's there as well. But in kind of rounding out my answer to the question, the long vectors of memory that we might like to consider in response to this also can include things such as the ebbing and flowing of censorship. That's had a shaping factor. The role of education, indeed, in shaping the types of questions that we might want to ask of a digital portal and about the past. So I think those contextual factors are really significant in trying to understand an answer to that question that you pose.
Yeah, thanks. It brings to mind that book called The Shock of the Old, which kind of talked about how old shipping, for example, a quite 19th century infrastructure, in fact, governs much of our world still. And so, yeah. But talking about mixtapes and kind of floppy disks, it brings to mind the question of forgetting. And in your presentation, you mentioned Paul Ricoeur and his insight that forgetting can be a collective act as well.
Mhm.
And digital platforms, of course, have often been criticized for inhibiting forgetting, through capturing and storing and selling personal data. And there's a whole kind of right to forget movement that comes
Mhm.
out of that. But I guess my question is, do you see digital technologies as playing a role not only in collective memory, but also in collective forgetting? So digital platforms such as Wikipedia, I'm asking here.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really great question. Collective forgetting, I think, can proceed by the purposeful and powerful overlaying of one form of memory making by another. So it's a competitive market out there for memories. And what happens if the dominant ones that one comes to through searching are not necessarily the most insightful, but the most promoted?
Mm,
So, rather than a website stating that kind of here's a bunch of things that happen that you ought to forget, the situation is rather that kind of search algorithms might bring you to a series of purported and sometimes heavily sponsored resources that occlude others, which potentially might be more helpful. And one might think, I guess, here of the contest over imperial memory in Britain, much in the news at the moment. And also, I think we're kind of in a world of digital overload, an absolute surfeit of kind of memories. And is it even possible to keep track at an individual level of one's own kind of archive of memories, let alone kind of collective memories that are shifting and sort of being shaped? And you're right about the kind of discussion about the right to forget. When we go on to websites such as Amazon and other places where we might buy things, there's a kind of a digital footprint there that remembers things and suggests other things that we might like based on the things that we perhaps bought before. And this can lead to a kind of sense, more generally, that we can defer the act of remembering things to the digital realm. So no need perhaps to remember your kind of login passwords if you trust, say, Google to do so and to suggest it when you log in. No need to remember the details of your flight booking if it's all sort of saved for you and where you went last time and so on and so forth. So there is an interesting interplay here between the act of digital remembering and the potential for people to rely on that and therefore take less interest in remembering things for themselves.
And how do you think that works in a kind of public context? So if we're
Mm.
thinking about national stories and national myths, which, are potentially a form of collective memory, where
Mm.
does the digital sit there? Um,
Mm. Well, I think the digital helps us understand that there is a plurality of memory making in public. And, as we've seen in recent years, there's less willingness to trust singular state narratives
mm,
of kind of public memory. So we might look back to, say, 2020, the response to the death of George Floyd, in Britain, the toppling of the Colston statue, in Australia, the kind of defacement of statues to colonial era figures, a kind of contest over those memories. I guess what's also interesting here is that we haven't yet seen the same type of pushback against organizations like Cambridge Analytica, who of course harvested all of that data from
mm,
Facebook, weaponized it for political
mm,
purposes a few years ago. And I guess the target's a bit less visible there. It's not a statue or a politician, but a server somewhere and some tech boffins
mm.
linked to it. And it's kind of harder to kind of protest that. Public memory is, of course, also shaped by the resources that we can access to understand it. So here we might think of an organization like Getty, for instance, who have bought up a lot of, well, billions of images from around the world. Now, on the one hand, that's useful in helping us understand things that have gone on in the past, they've protected many at-risk archives, for example, but also they're now behind a paywall often, or hard to find for the people whose communities those photographs were often physically removed from. So yeah, I guess how current and future generations will kind of remember, and based on what, remains an open question.
Yeah, I mean, you bring up this question of memory and power, which was is such an important thread of your presentation, but also of the literature more broadly, that the past is most often used to naturalize and justify existing social orders, and it's also recruited by those seeking to contest those social orders. But it is those are projects embedded in the present and shaped by the present. And I guess you also point out that the presence of the past, and you've just sort of spoken about it there, is much more diffuse now in the kind of digital landscape. And I imagine some of that diversity is, well, it's where it's located. It's less located in official state-based, perhaps, museums and sources, although they continue to play really important roles. But it's also in these sites of digital construction, which are owned by corporations rather than states, I guess. It's right. So if that is the context of, and you were talking about Getty and paywalls, but we can also think about Facebook or yes. And obviously Wikipedia is relatively unique in not being corporately owned or run. But I guess my question is, what do you think this means, this corporatization of the infrastructures of memory in the digital world? What do you think this means for the relationship between memory and power?
Oh, that's a big one. Well, I guess we have to start with thinking about how we understand memory as individuals. Yes, that can be by taking ourselves outside into the public realm, going to places like the COVID Memorial Wall. Other examples would be the kind of tribute memorial fence that grew up around the fringes of Ground Zero in the wake of 9/11, or indeed the ongoing memorialization at the site of the Grenfell Tower fire a few years ago. So we could access some of those more bottom-up type collective memory sites, but particularly popular still remain sites of kind of concerted pilgrimage for national reflection, albeit contested. So we could look at websites like London Remembers to kind of see efforts to track all the statuary and so on in London. But then in the terms of the digital, we also have to be aware of things like the filter bubble effect, whereby even the things that we are looking for, unless we're using perhaps a computer that we haven't touched before and we haven't left any kind of traces of cookies and so on, will automatically kind of send us things that are likely to kind of appeal to us, and within that also have things that are kind of sponsored. So there is a real sense, I think, in contemporary times that there is no singular narrative. It kind of can't hold, and in many ways that's I think a really good thing. We're not just approaching the building from the front, but able to kind of look around the back and the sides and from above and underneath and so on as well. So there's a sense that a more holistic perspective on memory might be possible. That said, the user needs to be kind of self-aware in order to want to seek that out.
Right.
So that's
I was going to say, so, but consensus, there might be a more rounded possibility, but consensus is not possible. Like consensus is such a key concept for Wikipedians.
Yeah, and yeah, you're dead right. So consensus is less and less possible, and you only need to look below the line on newspaper, online newspaper pages discussing anything to do with history to see that there really is a kind of bifurcation between views, and not just into two camps either. It's really a sense that people often responding on those pages don't trust the authority of so-called experts to purvey what they think about the past, and that includes historians too. The word bias is thrown around very easily. There's a lot of whataboutery. What about this example? What about that example? That, you know, the outlier that doesn't fit the main trend, and so on. Whether that is overall a good or bad thing, I think I want to think about some more. It would be interesting, you know, to ask that question of people who were researching in China, for instance. I wonder what they would think of that diversity of perspectives that's possible.
That's interesting. So I'll ask a kind of final question. What kinds of questions do you think the digital studies scholars at this conference, which is on Wikipedia and memory and critical approaches to Wikipedia, should be asking of the platform?
Well, I've got quite a lot to say here, so bear with me while I go through some of these questions that I think could be worth asking. I think firstly it'd be interesting to have scholars follow Pierre Norat's idea of pursuing what he termed ego-histoire. Now, that is to take some time to sit and write down and reflect on their own journeys into and through digital history and Wikipedia. So questions that one might ask could include, well, what can you remember about how old you were, where you were, and what you used to access history in this way? What sorts of things did you kind of want to find out at different times? What did you first go to a place like Wikipedia rather than a book for? What sorts of answers were you seeking to ascertain? When were you aware that Wikipedia might not be authoritative, might not be a kind of be-all and end-all of the subject? Do you now go, instead of to Wikipedia, to something like ChatGPT to ask those questions? And maybe what would you advise children to do who came to you wanting to know answers? I guess more with regard to memory studies specifically, I would also ask if you're aware that collective memories usually say as much about the moment of production and distribution as about the historic moments to which they refer, something that you mentioned earlier in our discussion. There's also the question of Wikipedia when, ? We historians like to kind of put things in order to know what followed what and so on. So when we reflect on Wikipedia in an academic article or a conference paper, which iteration of Wikipedia are we actually referring to? Those access dates that we often use in publications and so on are useful here. Is the study of Wikipedia for the purposes of history relentlessly contemporary, or can it be historicized too? What have been Wikipedia's rivals and continue to be those rivals elsewhere in the world? And why is it that some pages seem quite dormant for long periods of time and others are ever changing? And I guess finally, in response to this question, we could think again about context, because I think only through understanding that, as well as the digital text that we see on pages like Wikipedia, can we approach an understanding of the texture of the thing we wish to know, its true fabric, in other words. So a whole bunch of questions I would like to ask and encourage those attending this conference to ask themselves. I think particularly interesting would be to have them think back through their life and try and remember these moments of engagement.
I was just trying to think when my first engagement was, and I think it came with a very loud kind of danger warning from like some teacher at some point.
That's it.
Yeah, which is not, that has shifted. I mean, there's a history, that moment has passed, hasn't it?
It has.
Yeah. So thank you very much, Simon. I think in the online conference, we've now got a chance for some discussion, but I'm going to, oh, you have to leave us, sadly, but
Yes.
Michael Falk, who everyone will have met by now, has had the opportunity to watch the keynote already, and he has sent in an early question to get us going. So I'm just going to read it, and
Okay.
as the first of the questions from the floor, so to speak, and so you can have a crack.
Okay.
So you mentioned Elida Asman's distinction between canon and archive, which can be generalized to a distinction between active memory and storage memory. How viable is this distinction in practice? For instance, the COVID memorial wall appears simultaneously to be an archive of the lost and an active memory of the pandemic. These two aspects are hard to separate. It remains active because its archival appearance is so poetic. All those red hearts, he says. It puts me in mind of a similar kind of memory site, which is the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, which is active precisely because it poetically indicates an archive of the lost.
Okay, thank you indeed, Michael. I think that's a really terrific question. And I actually would really agree that Asman's distinction does break down with regard to the COVID memorial wall, where both elements operate in the same place. I guess the distinction, though, remains more useful beyond the contemporary. One could think of innumerable storage memory examples that are not particularly active, if at all. So early modern parliamentary rolls, for instance, rarely accessed, apart from by very specialist early modernist historians who want to find out things, or maybe looted artifacts would be an interesting one. These are severed from their cultural contexts and displayed in private homes or overseas museums, but they don't therefore have that connection with kind of public knowledge in the places that they were taken from. So I suppose, as with any schema, Asman's is both illuminating and limiting. Useful tool to work through, perhaps, but ultimately one to question and to problematize. I think the example of the unknown soldier, well, soldiers, because there are many memorials of this nature, one in Westminster Abbey, one in Canberra, for instance. I think that's a good example, because the soldiers who inhabit those unknown tombs could perhaps now be known if we wish to find out, thanks to genetic technologies, but the decision not to want to know who they are remains in place. And that's kind of significant, because those soldiers serve a metonymical function. He is one of them and all of us, to paraphrase Prime Minister Paul Keating and Don Watson, his very able scriptwriter.
Historian, scriptwriter.
Absolutely. And I guess that soldier remains one of us beyond the generational experience and indeed the memory of his cohort. So that kind of metonymical memory function is significant. Also, I think the Australian War Memorial is intriguing in another way, in that it is in some ways interactive, because the walls flanking the on the way into the tomb to the unknown soldier, one can pin poppies and sort of interact with the wall in some ways. And there may be a link between sites such as that. Perhaps it wasn't intended that that would happen when it was built, and places like the COVID Memorial Wall, which is all about interaction of the public. The hearts were painted in part by volunteers initially, but then inscribed by members of the public coming to want to pay tribute to their lost loved one in this kind of way. And for me, those kind of bottom-up public initiated memorials are the most interesting, rather than the imposed top-down type statues.
I mean, it's also the maintenance, isn't it? It's the maintenance of it. It's kept alive and active in an ongoing way through people coming to reinscribe the names.
That's right. And there's a whole series of volunteers. I've seen them just a few weeks ago by the Thames with official jackets on and going over the hearts, and they're quite worried about sunlight fading them, for instance. But one only has to go to a cemetery or graveyard to see that the tending of memories is a really important function for them to stay active. We've all seen kind of toppled or unreadable headstones, but also grave areas to which it appears that families are returning year on year to bring fresh flowers, cards, and so on. And if we extend that idea from the individual to the collective, I think that helps us understand that the tending and maintenance of memories is just as important as the creation of them, for them to continue to have wider meaning and importance, because there are all sorts of collective memories that have kind of been forgotten as well. It's not the case that everything just kind of keeps going and going and going and going. So I think that tending aspect is something important to consider too.
Do you think, I'm abusing my position here as the only person that can ask you questions. Do you think Wikipedia could be thought of then, and maybe this is where Michael was going, as both a way of tending, a form of attention and care to the memories of the past and the present, that keeps them alive, that keeps the past alive in the present, and also an archive that is there to be activated at various moments?
Yeah, I would say it in exactly that way. I think you know, it has the facility to be loved, tended, updated, tweaked, damaged, also defaced potentially by those who don't like what they see, or perhaps more positively put, edited in perhaps more useful ways. It is also an archive, but it's an archive that may not be as permanent as we might think. We've probably all had messages from Jimmy Wales and others involved with this wonderful website to kind of help out by paying for it, because it is remarkable, the funding model that they have managed to sustain and the number of pages that they've managed to kind of produce. But it may all one day kind of not be there, and it would only be through things like Wayback Machine and so on that we'd be able to kind of access it. We also have to remember that it is less accessible already in certain parts of the world, or certain pages are. So it's not a freely accessible resource for everyone, even now. So I think that's important to kind of remember as well.
Oh, nice pun to end on, Simon.
Sorry. Yeah.
Well, thank you again. Thank you so much both for your talk and for the conversation today. Simon, do you want to give another plug to your book? Do you have a copy there to hold up?
Embarrassingly, I probably do have a copy of the book. Hang on a second. That wasn't planted. It just, I was reading it to prepare. Yeah, we go. History, Memory and Public Life, the Past and the Present. And I'd like to say available in all good bookshops. Of course, that's not true, because it's an academic book. You will need to find it online or through your university library.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Have a good day there in London.
Thank you.
Stop recording.